Chapter 1. Introduction. Europe in Trench Warfare. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, no one had suspected that this conflict would develop into a years-long trench war that would cost the lives of millions of people. The political and military leaderships of the powers involved were convinced that the war would be decided within a few months. However, after the first battles on the Western Front in the autumn of 1914, it became clear that the old warfare, which relied on movement, cavalry attacks, and rapid battles, was no longer up to modern technical conditions. With the failure of the Schlieffen Plan and the Battle of the Marne, a new phase of the war began that was soon to shape the whole of Europe: trench warfare. The fronts froze. From the Belgian coast to Switzerland, an almost unbroken line of trenches, barbed wire, and fortifications stretched, which soon turned into a monstrous war landscape. The soldiers lived for weeks and months in trenches full of mud, rats, and corpses. Between the lines lay the no-man's land, a furrowed terrain of craters, barbed wire, and shattered trees that became a deadly obstacle when attacks were launched. Machine guns, which offered a tremendous advantage on the defensive, turned every advance into a massacre. The years 1914 and 1915 were marked by futile offensives, which often claimed tens of thousands of victims without the front line shifting decisively. Both the Allies and the Germans repeatedly tried to force a breakthrough at individual points, but the superiority of the defense nullified these efforts. The battles on the Somme, in Flanders, or in the Argonne had shown that even the greatest efforts brought little more than a few kilometers of territorial gain, and that at the price of immeasurable losses. In this context, the idea arose to no longer just hope for the decisive breakthrough, but to wear down the opponent through a battle of materials. The industrial dimension of the war became increasingly apparent. Millions of shells, new cannons, heavy artillery, mines, flamethrowers, and poison gas were used. The war became a confrontation in which not only soldiers, but also the economies competed against each other. Those who held out longer, those who could produce more material, and those who mobilized larger crowds of people were to have the upper hand in the end. After the fighting of 1915, Germany was in a difficult strategic position. Although great successes had been achieved against Russia in the east, the front was immovable in the west. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn, who had headed the Supreme Army Command since the end of 1914, was convinced that the war must not be decided by a quick victory, but by attrition. In his eyes, it was necessary to weaken France until it was ready for peace negotiations. He believed that the French will to resist could be broken by attacking at a symbolically significant point and forcing the French army to throw soldiers and material into a battle that could not be won. The choice fell on Verdun, a fortified city on the Meuse River that had been a symbol of French defense and national identity for centuries. Verdun lay like a key in the east of France, protected by a network of forts that had been expanded in the 19th century after the Franco-German War. For Falkenhayn, Verdun was the ideal place. He believed that the French would never allow this city to fall. That's why they would let their army bleed out there. That's how he put it in his plans. The German attack was not so much aimed at a quick success of conquest as at a huge battle of attrition that was to bring France to the brink of exhaustion. While the German plans were taking shape, a paralyzing stalemate continued to prevail on the Western Front. The soldiers on both sides had long since become accustomed to the everyday life of trench warfare. They lived in constant danger of being torn apart by shells und at the same time suffered from hunger, disease und the psychologische Stress of the constant state of war. Letters from soldiers tell of a life in the dirt, of the feeling of being imprisoned, and of the senselessness that many felt when another attack was launched, only to be aborted after a few hours with horrific losses. The war had also become a burden for the home fronts. Women worked in factories, children collected raw materials, entire economies were geared towards arms production. Hunger and deprivation were rampant, especially in Germany, where the British blockade made it difficult to supply food and raw materials. People began to perceive the war as an endless nightmare that seemed to have no purpose. In this situation, the German offensive against Verdun was announced at the beginning of 1916. It was to be the longest and most costly battle of the war, a symbol of senseless murder, and at the same time, a myth that is still anchored in the collective memory of France and Germany today. Verdun became not only a battlefield, but a place where the fate of Europe was condensed. The introduction to the Battle of Verdun is thus inseparably linked to the phenomenon of trench warfare. Without the rigidity of the fronts, without the experience of the years 1914 and 1915, it would hardly have been conceivable to plan a battle whose goal was not a quick victory, but the slow bleeding of the enemy. Verdun was the consequence of a war that had long since lost all illusion, a war that devoured men and material alike, a war that revealed modernity in its most destructive form. Thus, in February 1916, the battle began, which was to be considered synonymous with the First World War. Verdun stood for the senselessness, the ruthlessness, and the inhumanity of this war like hardly any other place. It was the beginning of a year that was to plunge Europe into a catastrophe that went deeper than anything people had known before. Chapter 2: The Road to Verdun. Strategic Importance. To understand the importance of Verdun in 1916, you have to go far back into the history of the city and look at its role as a border fortress between Germany and France. As early as the Middle Ages, Verdun was a military hub, a bulwark on the Meuse, which repeatedly played a central role in conflicts. In the Franco-German War of 1870–71, the fortress of Verdun was one of the last places to resist the German troops. This historical background gave it a special symbolic appeal for France. Whoever held Verdun was not only defending a piece of land, but also national honor. After the victory in 1871 and the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine by the German Empire, Verdun finally moved to the center of the French defense strategy. The city was only a few kilometers away from the new border that had been drawn after the war. To arm itself against a possible further German attack, France invested in a huge fortification system named after the Minister of War, Raymond Adolphe Serre de Rivière. The so-called Serre de Rivière's line consisted of a chain of modern forts that stretched along the eastern border of France and found one of their most important bases in Verdun. The fort system around Verdun was impressive. Dozens of forts and intermediate works were built in a belt around the city, including the later famous forts of Douaumont and Voie. These fortresses were built of concrete and steel, equipped with rotating tank turrets, heavy guns, and miles of underground passages. They were supposed to withstand modern artillery bombardment and prevent the enemy from taking the city. For France, these fortifications were not only military protective structures, but also symbols of defensiveness. Verdun embodied the unwavering will to defend the border against Germany. With the beginning of the First World War in 1914, Verdun immediately played a central role. The German army was advancing deep into France as part of the Schlieffen Plan, and Verdun was directly in the area of this offensive. Although the Germans did not succeed in conquering the fortress directly, they were approaching it dangerously. In the fighting of autumn 1914, Verdun became one of the cornerstones of the French defensive line, which stabilized after the Battle of the Marne. The city remained in French hands, but the front ran only a few kilometers away. In 1914 and 1915, Verdun remained a neuralgic point. Again and again, the Germans tried to break up the lines in the Argonne and on the Meuse, but without resounding success. It was clear to both sides that Verdun was of enormous importance. For France, it was a matter of honor to hold the fortress, and for Germany, it was a potential target to decisively weaken the French army. The geographical location made Verdun particularly valuable. The city was located on the river Maas, in a valley that opened up to the west like a corridor. Those who controlled Verdun could penetrate deep into France via this corridor and threaten important transport routes leading to Paris. In addition, Verdun was connected to its French homeland by railway lines and roads, making it an excellent supply base. For the Germans, an attack on Verdun offered not only symbolic but also strategic advantages. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn recognized this importance. He believed that the French army would be forced to hold Verdun at all costs. This would force them to throw more and more troops and material into battle. Unlike previous offensives aimed at a breakthrough, the attack on Verdun was to be a battle of attrition. Falkenhayn spoke of bleeding France dry. He assumed that the French would exhaust themselves in a defensive battle in this symbolic place, while Germany was in a favorable position to maximize their losses. Verdun was particularly attractive from a German point of view because it protruded into the German lines like a front ledge. The city formed a kind of bulge surrounded on three sides by German positions. This made it possible to lead an attack from several sides at the same time and to put pressure on the French defenses. At the same time, this situation meant that the French could only reach Verdun via a few supply routes, a circumstance that the Germans wanted to exploit. For the French side, however, Verdun was more than a military point. For centuries, the city has been a symbol of resistance to attacks from the east. Their loss would not only have been a strategic setback, but a psychological disaster. France had suffered the humiliation of the lost war in 1871, and Verdun was a bastion that obscured that memory. If the city fell, it would be a serious blow to national self-confidence and possibly a step towards peace negotiations, as Falkenhayn hoped. The strategic importance of Verdun thus consisted in a dangerous mixture of military value and symbolic radiance. For the Germans, it was the ideal battlefield to force France into a war of attrition. For the French, it was a place they could never give up. In this constellation, a gigantic, merciless battle was almost inevitable. In the winter of 1915-16, the Germans began to make their preparations. Huge amounts of artillery were massed, including the heaviest guns the Reich possessed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were transferred to the area around Verdun. Roads and railways were expanded for supplies. It was clear that this was the beginning of an offensive that would surpass anything that had existed before in its dimensions. The French sensed that an attack was imminent, but they underestimated the force with which it would take place. Many forts in the Verdun area had been partially disarmed or considered obsolete in the years before. It had been believed that the future of war no longer lay in fortresses, but in mobile artillery and infantry. This miscalculation was to prove to be momentous, because the German attackers would soon show that fortresses could also play a central role in modern war, albeit in a different way than expected. Thus, at the beginning of 1916, Verdun was the focus of strategic considerations. The city had become the key point of the Western War, a place where questions of strategy, symbolism, and national pride were condensed. The road to Verdun was not just the march of an army to a battlefield, but Europe's path to a battle that was to become a symbol of the horror of the First World War. Chapter 3. German Planning. Falkenhayn's Objective. When Erich von Falkenhayn, the head of the Supreme Army Command, made the decision at the end of 1915 to make Verdun the focus of a new offensive, he was under the pressure of a military and political impasse. Since the beginning of the war, neither side had been able to achieve a decisive breakthrough on the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, the front lines had been largely stable since the Battle of the Marne, and the years of fighting in Flanders, Champagne, and the Somme had claimed only immeasurable victims, without either side having clearly asserted itself. Even the victories in the East against Russia did not offer a final solution, because the war there tied up forces, but did not bring the decision that the German leadership had hoped for. Falkenhayn saw this deadlock as proof that a war of the movement in the West was no longer possible. Instead, the opponent must be forced to give up through systematic attrition. In a memorandum to Kaiser Wilhelm II, the authenticity of which was later repeatedly discussed, he is said to have written that France had to be bled dry. The goal was not to force a quick victory by conquering Paris or by breaking through at the front, but to weaken the French army in a battle to such an extent that it would collapse as a military force. After careful consideration, the choice of battlefield fell on Verdun. From a German point of view, the city combined several advantages. On the one hand, Verdun was of great symbolic importance for France. It was certain that the French leadership would never give up the city, even if it would have made military sense. On the other hand, Verdun was particularly exposed due to its location in a bulge in the front. German troops could attack from three sides, while the French had to organize their defense and supplies on a narrow corridor. This made them vulnerable and increased the pressure. Falkenhayn's plan was based on a cynical, but in his eyes, logical consideration. One did not have to conquer the city itself, but force the French to send reinforcements there again and again. Every attack, every defense costs human lives, and while France would eventually reach its limits, Falkenhayn believed that Germany had greater reserves. In his mind, Verdun was not so much a place to be owned, but rather a trap for the French army to fall into. For the implementation, the German leadership prepared a huge offensive. Around 1,200 guns were concentrated in the Verdun area, including some of the heaviest cannons the empire possessed. Particularly notorious were the Fat Bertha and other 42-centimeter mortars, which had destroyed Belgian fortresses as early as 1914. In addition, thousands of tons of ammunition were brought in via newly built railway lines and roads. The German artillery was to form the heart of the offensive, a barrage of unprecedented proportions that was to crush the French positions and demoralize the defenders. The infantry offensive was to be led by the Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm, the son of the Kaiser. Officially, the Crown Prince was the commander, but the actual management lay with his chief of staff, General Schmidt von Knobelsdorff, who coordinated the detailed planning. The Crown Prince himself was present, but played a more representative role militarily. For German propaganda, however, it was important that a member of the imperial family was at the forefront to underline the importance of the battle. The attack was originally planned for February 1916. The choice of season was deliberate. It was hoped that the bad weather, rain and fog, would hinder French aerial reconnaissance, while the Germans could make their preparations in secret. But adverse weather conditions delayed the start by several days. Nevertheless, it was possible to assemble a huge mass of troops, guns, and material without the French fully realizing the extent. Falkenhayn's objective was clearly defined. France was to be forced to concentrate on Verdun. There, it was to bleed to death in the truest sense of the word. He hoped that at this point, the French army would be so weakened that it would be willing to negotiate peace. At the same time, he was convinced that Britain, France's most powerful ally, would not be able to continue the war on its own without its partner. For him, Verdun was the key to breaking the Western Front, not by conquest, but by attrition. However, the planning had weaknesses that were only to become apparent in the course of the battle. Falkenhayn overestimated his own resources and underestimated the will of the French to persevere. He assumed that France would collapse after a few weeks of heavy losses. But he had not taken into account that a battle of this magnitude would also devour the German forces. The idea that Germany had inexhaustible reserves was a fallacy. The war had already claimed enormous victims in 1914 and 1915, and the German army was also at the limit of its capabilities. Nevertheless, the plan was pushed forward with great optimism. Preparations went like an assembly line. Roads were widened. Supply depots were created. Artillery positions were expanded. They wanted to make sure that the offense could start with maximum striking power. The belief in German superiority, in the power of artillery, and in the weakness of the enemy gave the planners the feeling that they were striking the decisive blow. For the soldiers who gathered in the forests and hills around Verdun, It was not yet foreseeable what hell was in store for them. Many believed that the offensive might decide the war. There was talk of a great blow, of a decisive battle. In the ranks of the officers, there were even ideas that a quick success could not only weaken France, but also strengthen morale in Germany, which had already fallen significantly after the long years of trench warfare. But the French army was by no means as weak as Falkenhayn believed. Verdun was a symbol for France that could not be allowed to fall. Even the planning of the German attack indirectly betrayed the importance that both sides attributed to this place. The Germans wanted to wear down France here. The French would fight for their national honor here. This prepared the ground for a battle that was to surpass all previous conflicts of the First World War in its duration, intensity, and brutality.
Wenn die deutschen Batterien begannen auf Februar 21, 1916, Falkenhayns Plan bekam Realität. Was war intendiert als ein deliberiertes Enterprise für Attrition, Sund entwickelte in ein monströs Maschinerie von Killing, das exzedierte die Erwartungen von allen involviert. Die an Idee von Machen Franz Blut turnte in ein Zwei-Wege-Blutbad, das der Welt wird forever erinnern als die Hell von Verdun.
Chapter 4. Verdun as a symbol of French resistance. In 1916, Verdun was not just a geographical point on the map, but a symbol that was more deeply rooted in the French self-image than any other fortress would have been. To understand why the French leadership and people were willing to make immeasurable sacrifices to defend this city, one must look at both the history and the emotional significance of Verdun. The city on the River Maas had already played a special role in the past. As a border town between the German and French cultural areas, Verdun has been the scene of conflicts for centuries, a place where the forces of Europe have repeatedly met. In the Middle Ages, the Frankish Empire was divided here in 843 by the Treaty of Verdun, an event that is widely regarded as the birth of France and Germany. This historical dimension already gave the city an aura that went far beyond its size. In the 19th century, after the Franco-German War of 1870–71, Verdun had become a symbol of resistance against German superiority. At that time, the French had painfully accepted the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, a humiliation that had seeped deep into the nation's collective memory. Verdun was only a few kilometers from the new border, and it became one of the most important bulwarks that would ensure the defense of France. For the French, it was the bastion that was supposed to prevent the empire from penetrating even further into their country. The fortifications that had been built in the course of the Sacrée des Rivières line added to the symbolic power. The forts around Verdun were considered an expression of French defensiveness as a monumental protective wall against the east. Although they had been partially disarmed in 1915 and considered obsolete, their symbolic value remained. Verdun stood for the idea, here we stand firm, here we will not give in. When the Germans began their offensive in February 1916, France immediately realized that it was not just a piece of land. It was about national honor, about the pride of a nation that had already suffered so many losses in the war and was now in danger of being struck in its heart. General Joseph Joffre, the commander-in-chief of the French army, and soon afterwards General Philippe Pétain, who took command of the defense area, knew that Verdun could not fall. The famous phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," "You won't get through," became the motto of the defenders and a symbol of the unwavering will to defy the attacks. For the French public, Verdun was the center of the war during these months. Newspapers reported daily on the fighting, and propaganda staged the battle as a struggle of the whole nation. Every Frenchman should identify with Verdun. Everyone should understand that the fate of France was decided here. Posters, speeches, and songs evoked the courage of the soldiers and portrayed them as heroes who withstood the attacks of an overpowering machine. For the soldiers themselves, Verdun was more than just a section of the front. Many experienced the defense as a kind of sacred duty. Letters and diaries tell of a deep awareness of being part of something bigger. Although the men suffered unimaginably from the constant shelling, from hunger, mud, and fear, At the same time, they knew that they were fighting for their country. Verdun became a myth even as the battle raged. The French leadership skillfully understood how to use this myth. General Pétain, who took command in the spring of 1916, became a figure of identification. He reorganized the defenses, improved supplies via the Voie Sacrée, the Holy Road, and gave the soldiers the feeling that they would not be abandoned. Under him, the image emerged that Verdun was a hell, but a hell that had to be endured together. This image helped to strengthen the will to persevere. Verdun's symbolic power was important not only internally, but also externally. It was important for the Allies to see that France did not give up. Britain and Russia watched the battle closely, and Verdun's steadfast defense showed that France was ready to continue the war despite all the losses. If Verdun had fallen, it would have severely shaken not only the morale of the French population, but also the confidence of the Allies. For Germany, on the other hand, Verdun soon became a double-edged symbol. Originally, Falkenhayn had planned to bleed France dry there. But the longer the battle lasted, the more it became clear that the German army also suffered unimaginable losses. Instead of destroying the symbol of France, the Germans helped to consolidate it. The harder they pressed, the stronger the defense became, a sign of national unity. Verdun thus became the moral defeat of Germany even before the battle ended. In France, Verdun already shaped the national consciousness during the war. For the people of the hinterland, it was the place where their brothers, sons, and fathers fought. For the women who worked in the factories, for the children who lived on rations in the cities, Verdun became a symbol of the sacrifices they made. It was the common point of reference of an entire nation that united more closely in the face of the German offensive. This symbolic power was to extend far beyond the war. As early as 1916, it was clear that no matter how the battle ended, Verdun would play a central role in France's collective memory. It was a place that was not only geographically, but also psychologically at the center of the nation. The defense of Verdun became a legend that was to be taught in schools, immortalized in monuments, and passed on in the culture of remembrance. Verdun was thus much more than just a battlefield. It was a national shrine, a cipher for resistance, sacrifice, and cohesion. It was the point at which France proved that it could not be broken, even in the darkest hour of the war. Chapter 5. The Beginning of the Offensive, February 1916. On the morning of February 21, 1916, the German offensive against Verdun began. What had been announced in the weeks and months before in careful preparation now unfolded with a violence that surprised even the most experienced frontline soldiers. Even before dawn, the batteries of the German artillery had taken up position in the woods and valleys around the front. Over 1,200 guns, including some of the heaviest guns of the war, were concentrated in a confined space. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the barrage began, which in its intensity exceeded all previous artillery preparations. Eyewitnesses report that the ground shook under their feet as if an earthquake was shaking the region. The sky was darkened by clouds of smoke, the air filled with the acrid smell of powder. The French trenches were overrun, often along with their defenders. Those who survived were powerless or in shock, unable to resist. For many, it was the epitome of modern warfare, a battle of material that made humans a marginal figure. After almost 9 hours of artillery preparation, the German infantry advanced. Shock troops, supported by flamethrowers and machine guns, attacked the smashed French lines. The Fifth Army, under Crown Prince Wilhelm, in particular, launched its attacks with great force. The plan was to advance on a narrow section of the front along the right bank of the Meuse in order to take over the heights and villages around Verdun step by step. At first, the plan seemed to work. Many French units were decimated or demoralized by the barrage. Entire trench lines no longer existed, and the few survivors could hardly withstand the attacks of the German infantry. Villages such as Beaumont, Haumont, and Brabant quickly fell into German hands. The advance seemed unstoppable, and in Berlin there was already talk of imminent success.
But the French leadership reacted faster than expected. General Joseph Joffre realized that Verdun was in imminent danger and immediately ordered reinforcements into the threatened sector. Within a few days, entire divisions were withdrawn from other sections of the front and transferred towards Verdun. This was the beginning of a race. While the Germans tried to break through the defenses once and for all, the French mobilized all available reserves to stabilize the front.
One of the central points was Fort Douaumont, the largest and most modern fortress in the defensive ring around Verdun. Although it had been almost unoccupied and largely disarmed since 1915, it retained symbolic and strategic importance. When the Germans unexpectedly entered the fort on February 25 and captured it practically without a fight, it was a shock for France. The loss of Douaumont was portrayed in the French press as a catastrophe, a betrayal of the nation. Morale threatened to break, and in Paris people already feared the collapse of the front. At the same time, however, the threat had a mobilizing effect. General Philippe Pétain was entrusted with the defense of Verdun. He brought a new attitude to the struggle, sober, pragmatic, focused on perseverance. Under his command, the famous Voie Sacrée, the sacred road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, became the lifeline of the defense. Trucks rolled incessantly along this single intact supply route, bringing ammunition, weapons, food, and soldiers to the front. Columns were on the move day and night, and Pétain made sure that not a day went by without reinforcements. Meanwhile, the German leadership increased the pressure. New attacks were launched. The artillery continued its work of destruction tirelessly. Villages such as Douaumont, Voie, and Fleury became the scene of fierce fighting. Again and again, the Germans succeeded in making minor territorial gains, but the French threw themselves at each other with fanatical resistance. Every meter of ground cost hundreds, sometimes thousands, of lives. The beginning of the offensive was therefore marked by a huge discrepancy. On the one hand, there was the German superiority in artillery and the initial surprise effect. On the other hand, the French determination to hold Verdun at all costs. The planned blow, which was to exhaust France in a few weeks, developed into a battle with no foreseeable end in the first few days. For the soldiers at the front, the offensive marked the beginning of a martyrdom. Unimaginable conditions prevailed in the ditches and dugouts. Constant shelling, mud, cold, and constant death shaped life. Injured people often lay in no man's land for hours without anyone being able to rescue them. Grenades shredded bodies. The earth was littered with corpses. Soldiers later reported that the smell of decay was omnipresent, that it was almost impossible to distinguish where earth ended and where bodies began. Nevertheless, a feeling of pride developed among the French soldiers. Verdun became a touchstone, a place where you had to prove yourself. On ne passe pas, they won't get through, was not just a slogan, but became a lived conviction. Even in the darkest hours, the defenders did not give up, but held their positions with a tenacity that surprised even the Germans. The start of the offensive in February 1916 marked the start of one of the longest and bloodiest battles in history. What was intended as a planned blow to weaken France turned into a mutual struggle within days that was to last months. The violence of the barrage, the tenacity of the defenders, and the importance of the site made Verdun more than just a battlefield. It became a legend. Chapter 6: The German Artillery Preparation. The Battle of Verdun cannot be understood without the role of German artillery. From the very beginning, it was the heart of Falkenhayn's plan. His considerations were not about quickly making large territorial gains through skillful infantry operations, but about systematically destroying the enemy with unprecedented fire. In the weeks before the attack, the German army had already amassed a huge number of guns around Verdun, an artillery mass that had hardly been seen in this war until then. Over 1,000 guns of all calibers were positioned in a confined space. Among them were light field guns, medium howitzers, and heavy mortars, up to the gigantic 42-centimeter guns that had already destroyed the Belgian fortresses in 1914. The logistics necessary to get these weapons and the unimaginable quantities of ammunition to the frontline area were a masterpiece. Railway lines were built close to the front, new roads were built, and countless ammunition depots were built. Entire patches of forest were transformed into huge artillery parks, where cannon barrels rose into the sky like a forest of metal. The preparation for the bombing was meticulously planned. Each gun was given clearly assigned targets: trenches, dugouts, communication routes, artillery positions, villages, fortresses. They wanted to destroy not only the first line of defense of the French, but also the possibility of bringing in reinforcements or caring for the wounded. The goal was a total destruction of the defense system. On February 21, 1916, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the barrage began. Within a few minutes, the air filled with a thunder that drowned out everything. Contemporary witnesses report that the ground shook under their feet as if an earthquake were shaking the region. The sky was darkened by smoke and dust raised by the impacts. Shell after shell struck the French lines, destroying trenches, tearing soldiers to pieces, and leaving craters that soon lined up like a lunar landscape. In the first few hours, the fire was concentrated on the foremost positions. Entire French units disappeared in the flood of shells. Those who survived were often so shocked that they could hardly resist. But the bombardment went far beyond the first line. Roads, bridges, depots, and villages were also shelled. The aim was not only to break the defenses, but also to cut off supplies and destroy the morale of the entire French front. The effect on the French soldiers was devastating. Many sat in their shelters for days without the possibility of getting food or water. The constant thunder, the trembling of the ground, the stench of powder and decay, all this brought her to the brink of madness. Letters from survivors report that during this time, one lost all idea of day and night. Everything was just noise, smoke, and fear. But as destructive as the fire was, it had its limits. Since 1914, the French army had learned to build deeper shelters, often several meters underground, protected by steel girders and concrete. Many soldiers survived the barrage in these bunkers, even if they came to the surface traumatized after days in stuffy confinement. In addition, the French had created a network of reserve positions in the Verdun area, which enabled them to resist even after the loss of the front trenches.
Der deutsche Artilleriepräparation war auch so impressiv, weil es neue Methodiswar anwendete. Instatt von just indiskriminiert Schellen entire Sektionen der Front, die Deutschen treibten zu Werk spezifisch mit Feuerrollern, Artilleriebarrieren, das movte wie ein Korten in Front der avanzenden Infanterie. Dies Taktik wurde nicht intendiert, den Defendern eine Möglichkeit zu geben, aus ihren Dugouts zu kommen und die Attackanten mit Maschinenguns zu stoppen. Obwohl diese Methode noch nicht matur war, es schonte die Evolution der Warfare. Artillerie wurde nur used als Präparation, sondern als ein integraler Teil der Offensive.
Another feature of the preparation was the psychological effect. Falkenhayn deliberately relied on an inferno that was to break the French will. The idea was that no human being could withstand such a permanent burden. In fact, the psychological impact was enormous. Many French who survived the first days were so traumatized that they were unable to fight. The term shell shock took on a new meaning in Verdun. But the German leadership underestimated the ability of the French to adapt to this hell. After only a few days, French officers managed to regroup the survivors, bring in reinforcements, and take countermeasures. The shock was great, but it did not completely paralyze the defense. Rather, a desperate will to defend developed, which formed the basis for French perseverance in the coming months. The artillery preparation was not a foregone conclusion for the German side either. The consumption of ammunition was gigantic. Within a few days, millions of shells were fired. Logistics groaned under the burden of bringing supplies from the hinterland to the front. Entire platoons were used exclusively for ammunition supplies. It soon became clear that such an intensity of fire could not be sustained indefinitely. In addition, the enormous destruction of the site also had disadvantages for the attackers. The no-man's land turned into an impassable sea of craters, mud, and debris. The German infantry, which was supposed to advance after the artillery, often found itself in a chaos that made it difficult for it to advance. Machine guns that had survived the shelling could still cut deadly paths into the ranks of the attackers. Thus, perfect preparation also became an obstacle to success. In retrospect, the German artillery preparation at Verdun is often seen as the beginning of a new dimension of the war. Never before had firepower been concentrated to such an extent. Never before had they tried to raze an entire region to the ground with artillery. It was a harbinger of industrial warfare, in which humans increasingly became a marginal figure and machines set the pace. Despite all the destruction and the initial success, the breakthrough failed to materialize. France did not collapse, and Verdun did not fall. Instead of wearing down the enemy, the German army also began to bleed dry in this materiel battle. The artillery preparation, which was intended to be the key to victory, became the prelude to a battle that was to push both sides to the limit of what was bearable. Thus, at the end of the first phase, there was the realization that even the most powerful artillery was not in a position to decide the war on its own. It could destroy, kill, and devastate the terrain, but it could not break the will of a people who had chosen to stand. Chapter 7: The First Attacks and the Fall of Fort Douaumont. After the unprecedented artillery bombardment that had opened the offensive on 21 February 1916, the German infantry launched an attack, with shock troops moving through the smoke-filled, tattered landscape, accompanied by flamethrowers, machine guns, and smaller artillery units covering the advance. The terrain, crisscrossed by craters, remnants of barbed wire, and shattered tree stumps, made the advance difficult, but the French were badly hit. Many of their trenches no longer existed, their defenses were patchy, and the survivors sat in dugouts, often isolated and unconnected to their superiors. In the first few days, the Germans were able to make rapid gains in territory. Villages such as Haumont, Brabant, and Somonia fell into their hands one after the other. These places were strategically important because they were located on the access routes to the heights north of Verdun. For the German soldiers, who were once again experiencing an advance after months of grueling trench warfare, this meant a mixture of euphoria and horror. They saw the enemy retreat, but at the same time, they waded through a sea of corpses, rubble, and mud. Particular attention was paid to the ridges around the Meuse, in particular Fort Douaumont. This fort, built in 1885, was the largest and strongest structure in the fortress belt around Verdun. It had massive walls, armored turrets, and miles of underground passages that could accommodate hundreds of soldiers. Theoretically, it was considered impregnable. But by 1915, French military planners had disarmed many forts, believing that they would be powerless against the superior German artillery in modern war. Douaumont was therefore provided with only a small garrison, and its main guns were largely dismantled. On February 25, 1916, the Germans achieved a coup that became a legend. A small detachment under Lieutenant Eugen Rodke, consisting of pioneers and infantrymen, penetrated the fort after a long, costly advance. Through a ventilation pipe and inadequately guarded entrances, the Germans entered the interior. There, they met only a handful of surprised French soldiers who offered little resistance. Within a few hours, the largest and most modern Fort Verdun was in German hands, and almost without a fight. The news of the capture of Douaumont spread like wildfire. In Germany, it was celebrated as a triumph. Newspapers proudly announced that the impregnable bastion had fallen, and some already believed that Verdun would be completely in German hands in a few days. Kaiser Wilhelm II sent congratulations, and Crown Prince Wilhelm had himself staged as a symbol of success. Propaganda used the fall of the fort to underpin the image of the invincibility of the German army. For France, on the other hand, the news came as a shock. The loss of Douaumont was more than just a military setback. It hit the nation's self-image to the core. In Paris, there was talk of a catastrophe, of negligence, of an impending disaster that could bring down the front. General Joffre, the commander-in-chief, was beside himself, and a storm of indignation broke out in the French press. How could it be that one of the most important fortresses had fallen into enemy hands practically without a fight? But as much as the fall of Douaumont gave the impression of a decisive breakthrough in the first days, it soon became clear that it did not mean the end of the battle. Although the Germans now had a huge base directly in front of Verdun, the French defense system did not collapse. On the contrary, the loss mobilized a wave of resistance that welded France together. General Philippe Pétain took command at Verdun and made it clear that there could be no turning back. He immediately organized countermeasures, ensured the massive supply via the Voie Sacrée, and had the defensive lines rebuilt. The fighting in the days following the fall of the fort was marked by unprecedented severity. The Germans tried to build on their success, but met with increasing resistance. The French had understood that any further loss would have catastrophic consequences and threw everything into the balance to hold Verdun. Divisions from all parts of the front were sent to the Verdun pocket. For many soldiers, the deployment there was tantamount to a death sentence, but they obeyed because they knew that more than a few kilometers of ground were at stake. The fall of Douaumont represented a turning point in the beginning of the offensive. What was intended as a planned lightning strike developed into a merciless battle of materials. The Germans had conquered an important symbol, but they had not broken the enemy. On the contrary, the French were now more determined than ever. Every loss, every new shell, every night in the trenches reinforced the feeling that Verdun had to be defended, whatever the cost. The first attacks also showed the limits of German planning. Although the artillery had caused enormous destruction, it could not completely paralyze the French defenses. Again and again, there were units that resisted, machine guns that stopped attacks, and officers who drove their men despite all the losses. The terrain the Germans gained was small compared to the losses they suffered. Instead of a quick success, the fight threatened to get bogged down. For the soldiers on both sides, the start of the offensive was a foretaste of the hell that was to follow in the coming months. The fall of Fort Douaumont was spectacular, but it did not usher in the end, but the beginning of a merciless struggle that would claim countless lives. The Germans had captured the strongest fort, but they had also challenged the French to throw all their strength into the defense. A planned blow to attrition turned into the battle that was to go down in history as the symbol of the First World War par excellence, Verdun. Chapter 8. French Reactions and Pétain's Role. The fall of Fort Douaumont on February 25, 1916, shook France like a thunderclap. It was not just a military loss, but a psychological shock that affected the public and the army alike. Newspapers and politicians spoke of negligence, some even of betrayal. How could a fortress that was considered a symbol of French strength fall into German hands almost without a fight? The answer lay in the strategic misconception that the fortresses would no longer play a role in a modern artillery battle. But this explanation was of little comfort to the people at the time. Panic spread in Paris, and despair reigned in the trenches around Verdun. General Joseph Joffre, the commander-in-chief of the French army, knew that the situation required a decisive response. The loss of Douaumont was not allowed to become a domino effect that shook the entire defense system. At a critical hour, he decided to entrust command of the Verdun sector to a general who had already distinguished himself by prudence and organizational skills, Philippe Pétain. Pétain was not a hero of the nation at this point, but a middle-ranking officer who had taken on greater responsibilities late in his career. He was not considered a daredevil, but a sober, realistically thinking soldier. While other generals relied on attack and offensive, Pétain had recognized early on that modern war was characterized by artillery, supplies, and perseverance. It was precisely these qualities that made him the ideal commander for Verdun. When Pétain took command at the end of February, the situation was critical. The Germans had taken Douaumont, were advancing, and now threatening other key positions such as Fort Vaux. The French lines were shattered, morale was battered, and the soldiers, who had been under continuous fire for days, were physically and mentally exhausted. Pétain immediately realized that he had to do two things: stabilize the defenses and restore the morale of his men. His first measure was of an organizational nature. He ensured that the Voie Sacrée, the Holy Road, from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, became the uninterrupted lifeline of the defense. On this 60-kilometer road, columns of trucks rolled day and night, bringing soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and food to Verdun. Pétain organized the traffic in such a way that vehicles drove every few seconds, guarded by military police and supported by workshops, which repaired damage immediately. This logistical feat made it possible to bring new troops to the front every day and to regularly relieve exhausted units. With this rotation system, Pétain ensured that the same men were not always exposed to the unimaginable strain. Every French soldier was to do his part in defense of Verdun, but no one was to have to stay in hell all the time. This measure was crucial to maintain resistance in the long term. It was fundamentally different from the German practice, which often left the same units in action for months and thus wore down morale more quickly. In addition to organization, Pétain's second strength was his ability to communicate with the soldiers. He visited the front, talked to officers and ordinary soldiers, listened to their concerns, and gave the feeling that their sufferings were seen and understood. His sentence, "Courage, on les aura," "Courage, we will get them," became a motto that gave courage and hope. Pétain was not a general who gave orders from a safe distance, but one who made men feel that he was fighting with them. Under his leadership, the French artillery also took on a new role. Pétain understood that the key to defense lay not only in the trenches, but in the ability to respond to the German attack with a massive countershot. He had large quantities of guns and ammunition brought to the Verdun sector and used them specifically to keep the German positions, supply routes, and captured positions under continuous fire. In particular, Fort Douaumont, which was in German hands, was incessantly shelled. In doing so, Pétain made it clear to the Germans that no victory was final and that every meter of ground had to be bought with countless losses. The French public reacted quickly to the new tone. Propaganda and the press picked up on Pétain's words, and Verdun became a symbol of unwavering resistance. "On ne passe pas," "they can't get through," became the motto of the nation. In schools, factories, and villages, people talked about the fact that Verdun had to be held, no matter what the price. The soldiers who were sent to the cauldron felt part of a national task. Verdun became a test that everyone had to pass, and thus also a myth that was to have an impact far beyond the war. For the Germans, Pétain's role had unexpected consequences. Falkenhayn's plan had been designed to bleed France dry at Verdun, but under Pétain's leadership, the struggle developed into a bloodbath on both sides. The French held their ground, and the longer the battle lasted, the more the Germans suffered from the gigantic losses. The trap that Falkenhayn had set up became a grave for both armies. Pétain knew that the battle would not be decided by quick victories, but by perseverance. That is why he relied on systematic defense, not on risky counteroffensives. He only allowed attacks when they were really necessary, for example, to recapture lost positions or to increase pressure on the Germans. His strategy was defensive, but effective. It contradicted the French military dogma of the offensive, but it saved Verdun. Over time, Pétain became a symbolic figure. In France, people spoke of the Lion of Verdun. His popularity grew, and for many, he became the epitome of a general who not only made plans, but also understood the suffering of his men. Verdun made him famous and laid the foundation for his later role in the war. The French reactions to the beginning of the battle showed how strongly national symbolism and individual leadership can intertwine. The shock of Douaumont turned into determination, the terror of the artillery into pride in being part of a common defense. Pétain embodied this attitude and made it the engine of resistance. Thus, in the spring of 1916, Verdun was transformed from an impending catastrophe into a place of hope. France had found its answer, not in a quick victory, but in unshakable perseverance. Verdun became the symbol that Pétain had formed, and his role in it remained inextricably linked to the legend of this battle. Chapter 9. Everyday Life in the Inferno, Soldiers in the Trenches. For the soldiers who fought in Verdun in the spring and summer of 1916, everyday life was an ordeal that can hardly be put into words. While the generals made their plans and the states debated strategy and war aims, the men at the front lived day after day in a world defined by dirt, blood, death, and despair. In previous years, trench warfare had already shown the conditions prevailing in the trenches, but in Verdun, hell reached a new dimension. The ditches themselves were often little more than makeshift dug depressions in the earth. In the first days of the German attack, many positions had been completely destroyed by artillery fire. Where once there had been trenches, there were now gaping craters. The soldiers had to dig new cover, often under heavy fire. But the ground was soggy, full of water and corpses. Rain turned the trenches into mud gullies in which the men sank up to their knees. Pumps were constantly running, but they couldn't stop the mud. In this mud, the soldiers lived, fought, and died. Rats, attracted by the countless dead, swarmed in the ditches. Some became so big that they no longer bothered people and ate directly from food supplies. Diseases such as dysentery and typhoid fever spread. The soldiers suffered from lice that covered their bodies and caused unbearable itching. The stench of decay hung constantly in the air. Dead comrades could often not be recovered for days because the no-man's land between the lines was impassable. So they lay next to the living until they sank into the mud or were torn apart by new shells. The greatest torment, however, was the continuous shelling. Day and night, shells howled, exploded with a deafening noise, and tore open the ground. It was impossible for the men in the ditch to sleep or even to find a moment's rest. The thunder of the guns, the whistling of the projectiles, and the crash of the impacts incessantly afflicted the nerves. Many soldiers developed symptoms that were called grenade shock at the time: tremors, paralysis, loss of speech, or complete apathy. Today, one would speak of post-traumatic stress disorder. Everyday life consisted of waiting, hoping, and surviving. For hours, the men squatted in wet shelters with the constant fear that the next grenade could hit them. When an attack was ordered, it meant advancing through no man's land, an area dotted with craters, crisscrossed by barbed wire, and covered by machine guns. Many attacks ended in a massacre after just a few meters. Those who were injured often lay for hours in the open area while comrades desperately tried to rescue them. Despite this hell, the soldiers developed routines. They made coffee on small spirit stoves when they had the opportunity, or shared tin cans. They smoked cigarettes to calm the nerves. Some wrote letters home, in which they tried to conceal their situation so as not to burden their families. Others openly reported the despair, the fear of never returning. Letters became a lifeline that made men feel that there was still a world outside the front line worth fighting for. Companionship was another key to survival. In the midst of death and horror, the soldiers developed a deep bond with each other. People were dependent on each other in order not to lose their minds. A shared piece of bread, a cigarette, a joke in a break between attacks, all of this was priceless. The men knew that they were lost without their comrades. This feeling of solidarity helped many to endure the inconceivable. But there were also moments of brutalization. The constant sight of death dulled. Some soldiers later reported that after weeks in Verdun, they hardly felt any empathy for suffering. It was as if humanity had been extinguished in the continuous fire. Others, on the other hand, clung all the more to small gestures of humanity in order not to lose their dignity. Despite the efforts, the supply situation was often miserable. Although the Voie Sacrée brought supplies incessantly, many things did not reach the front. Bread was old and hard, water was dirty, and hot meals were rare. Alcohol, especially wine or schnapps, became a means of comfort, which the soldiers consumed in mass. Quite a few went on attacks half drunk because it made the fear more bearable. The French strategy of rotation also shaped everyday life. Pétain had decreed that as many soldiers as possible were temporarily deployed in Verdun, so that almost every French division fought in hell at some point. For the men, this meant that they were relieved after weeks of torment, only to know that they might have to return later. This constant uncertainty as to whether or not they had survived Verdun for good weighed heavily on many. Die Deutschen suffered von similar conditions. Their trenches waren auch mudhells. There too lebt unter continuous fire. There too waren erfragt von Attacken bei Bayonets, Flamethrowers und Handgrenades. Die Differenz war oft nur in der Supply Routes. Weil die Franzosen organisierten eine Continuous Supply via die Holy Road, die Deutschen hatten größere Difficultäten regelmäßig Supplyen der Truppen in dem Bombed Area. Für Managermen Soldaten holding captured positions sowie Fort Douaumont bekam ein Nightmare.
So, everyday life in Verdun was a life on the edge of resilience. Every day was a fight for survival, every hour a test. The inferno, which dragged on for months, changed the men forever. Many returned physically, but inwardly they remained broken. Others found a sense of purpose in the camaraderie and in the thought of defending their homeland, which helped them to continue. Verdun was more than a battle. For the soldiers who fought there, it was an experience that overshadowed their entire existence. Everyday life in the trenches was not an episode, but a permanent state of horror that only ended with death or detachment. This experience made Verdun what it symbolizes to this day, the absolute intensification of the horror of the First World War.
Chapter 10. The Moloch Verdun, the barrage without end. Hardly any other image is as emblematic of the Battle of Verdun as the incessant thunder of artillery. From the very beginning, the battle was a battle of material in which the barrage became an omnipresent reality. Verdun became a Moloch, a gigantic monster that tirelessly devoured people and material. Soldiers who survived the fighting describe the experience of continuous shelling as something beyond human understanding. It was a noise that ate away at the soul, a roar that shook the body, a violence that could turn into death at any moment. The barrage began on February 21, 1916, and practically did not stop until the end of the year. Although there were phases of greater or weaker intensity, the front never experienced complete calm. Day and night, shells thundered down on the positions. Entire landscapes were razed to the ground in a few days. Forests disappeared. Hills were removed. Villages existed only as piles of rubble. Every square centimeter of ground was crisscrossed by craters in which water and blood stood. For the soldiers in the trench, this constant shelling was the greatest torture. There was no safe place, no way to escape the inferno. Even in deep dugouts, you were never really protected. Grenades fell, blew up ceilings, suffocated men in smoke, or buried them under masses of earth. Those who were not hit directly lived in constant fear that the next salvo could catch them. This tension over weeks and months caused many to break. The barrage was more than just a weapon, it was psychological torture. Men returning from Verdun reported that long after the battle they flinched at the sound of thunder or felt the ground shook beneath them. Some suffered from insomnia, tremors, panic attacks. At that time, people spoke of a nervous breakdown or grenade shock, but what the soldiers went through corresponded to what we understand today as severe traumatization. The intensity of the fire was unprecedented. There are estimates that several million shells were fired in the first few days alone. Over the course of the entire battle, over 60 million shells were fired, enough to hit every square meter of ground around Verdun dozens of times. The sky was filled with clouds of smoke, the thunder echoed for miles, and even in the villages far behind the front, you could feel the tremor of the earth. But the barrage did not spare the attackers either. For the German soldiers, who had to hold out in the captured positions, it was just as much torture. Fort Douaumont, which had fallen in February, turned into a death trap. French shells constantly hit the structure, killing crews, setting fire, and triggering explosions. Hundreds of German soldiers died in the underground passages of the fort, imprisoned, suffocated, or burned. The possession of Douaumont was strategically important for the Germans, but for the men inside, it became a prison of death. Logistics also suffered from the constant shelling. Roads and narrow-gauge railways were bombed incessantly, so that supplies were only possible with the greatest sacrifices. Drivers of trucks and ammunition trains lived in permanent danger of death. One hit could be enough to blow up entire columns. Nevertheless, the supply continued to roll, an uninterrupted stream that made the battle possible in the first place. Without this logistics, Verdun would have collapsed after a few days. For the landscape, the barrage meant destruction that is still visible today. Forests were wiped out, rivers changed their bed, fields were turned into wasteland. Even today, the forests around Verdun are crisscrossed by shell craters, many as large as small ponds. This is known as the Zone Rouge, the red zone that was declared uninhabitable after the war. The earth was contaminated with metal and poison gas, corpses lay everywhere, and it took decades for the area to become halfway habitable again. In battle, the barrage was also an instrument of tactics. The Germans used it to prepare French lines and cover the advance of their infantry. The French responded with return fire, which was intended to hit German positions and supply routes. Often, the artillery duel itself was the real core of the battle, while infantry attacks were only the result. Verdun showed that World War I was essentially an artillery war. Machine guns, bayonets, and rifles were crucial, but the real destruction came from the gun barrels. The soldiers called the barrage the Moloch because it devoured everything: life, landscape, hope. No one could escape his power. Even officers who were far behind the front line were exposed to the impacts. For the ordinary soldiers, it was a feeling of complete powerlessness. You couldn't shoot back, you couldn't dodge, you couldn't escape. You could only wait and hope that you would be spared. Sometimes shelling lasted for days. Men sat in their dugouts, without food, without sleep, in the dark, while the earth shook above them. When the fire subsided, they knew an attack was imminent, and then they had to get out of their covers and into the shattered no-man's land to face the enemy. The transition from barrage to infantry assault was the most terrible moment for many, because it marked the end of relative security and the beginning of a new massacre. But despite all the destruction, the barrage often did not achieve what its planners had hoped. Many dugouts held out, many defenders survived, and as soon as the fire stopped, they climbed out of the rubble to confront the attackers with machine guns and rifles. Thus, a deadly ritual was repeated: days of bombardment followed by attacks that collapsed under machine gun fire. The Moloch devoured both sides equally. The barrage of Verdun is still a symbol of industrial killing today. It was war in its dehumanized form, reduced to machines, ammunition, and destruction. In it, man was little more than a victim, at the mercy of a violence he could not control. Verdun made visible what the First World War meant: the transition to a warfare that no longer sought victory on the battlefield, but wanted to wear down the enemy through annihilation. For the soldiers, the barrage was the epitome of horror. Many who survived later said that Verdun had marked their lives forever. They had seen hell in the months of continuous fire, and nothing in their later lives could ever suppress the sights, sounds, and smells they experienced there. So Verdun became a Moloch, a battle that not only killed people, but also the belief in the meaning of war. The barrage that never ended was the sound of an era drowned in the blood and thunder of World War I. By the time the summer of 1916 began, the Battle of Verdun had already devoured millions of shells and claimed hundreds of thousands of victims. But there was no end in sight. What had begun in February as a targeted German offensive had long since become a grueling struggle in which neither opponent wanted to give in. June and July 1916 were marked by a murderous rhythm of attacks and counterattacks, which repeatedly turned the area around the fortress into a chaotic battlefield. After the capture of Fort Douaumont in February and the capture of further positions in the spring, the German leadership hoped to be able to take Verdun step by step in the pincers. Falkenhayn's original plan to bleed France dry at this focal point had already led to enormous losses, but the decisive breakthrough had failed to materialize. Instead, Pétain maintained the defense, and the French resistance grew tougher with each passing day. Now the Germans were looking for further successes to demonstrate their superiority and force the French to give in.
A central target was Fort Vaux, located east of Verdun. The Germans had already tried to take this bulwark in the spring, but it was not until the beginning of June that they succeeded after days of fighting. The defense of Vaux became one of the most impressive episodes of the battle. Under the command of Major Sylvain Raynal, the French soldiers held the fort in a desperate situation. For days they were harassed by flamethrowers, poison gas, and grenades, without sufficient water supplies, without hope of relief. Finally, they had to surrender on June 7th, but their resistance immediately became a myth in France. Raynal was honored despite his capture, and Fort Vaux was henceforth regarded as a symbol of heroic perseverance. For the Germans, the fall of Vaux seemed to be another step towards victory. But as with Douaumont, this success proved to be a double-edged sword. The fort was under constant French fire, and the conquerors had to hold it in catastrophic conditions. In addition, the French resistance was unbroken. Instead of a collapse, the loss of Vaux mobilized the nation again, and General Robert Nivelle, who replaced Pétain in the high command in the summer, promised the French, "They won't get through."
The summer brought an intensification of the mutual struggle. The Germans did everything they could to advance further and concentrated their attacks on the ridges that dominated the city of Verdun. In particular, the battles for Fleury, Thiamont, and the Ouvrage de Froid de Terre developed into downright hellish battles. These places changed hands several times, sometimes within a few days. Each attack began with hours of barrage, followed by waves of infantry rushing across the bombed-out no-man's land. No sooner had the Germans taken up a village or a position than a French counterattack followed, supported by artillery and fresh troops brought in via the Voie Sacrée.
The landscape had long been unrecognizable. Fleury, once a small village, was conquered and lost 16 times between June and August 1916. In the end, it no longer existed. Only rubble and craters marked the place where people had lived. For the soldiers who fought there, Fleury was a nightmare. Grenades tore the earth, flamethrowers turned dugouts into fiery hells, and machine guns mowed down rows of attackers. Many men no longer fought for honor or fame, but only for bare survival. In July, the German advance reached its peak. On July 11th, the Germans launched a massive attack on the heights of Souville, the last significant bastion before the city itself. If Souville had fallen, the Germans would actually have been able to invade the fortress of Verdun, but this is where they met with the fiercest resistance. French soldiers held the line despite unimaginable losses. Artillery fire turned the height into a field of rubble, but the defenders did not give in. The attack failed, and the Germans had to retreat exhausted. This failure marked a turning point. While the Germans continued to fight at Verdun, their offensive had effectively come to a standstill. The French had proven that, despite all the losses, they were not prepared to give up Verdun. On the contrary, the defense grew in strength, and Nivelle began to systematically prepare counterattacks. In addition, there was a factor that changed the entire situation. On July 1, 1916, the British and French began their major offensive on the Somme. This battle, which had been opened under pressure from the French, was intended to relieve the German forces by forcing the opponents to withdraw troops from Verdun. That is exactly what happened. The German Supreme Army Command had to transfer units from the Verdun sector to the Somme in order to counter the new threat. The Germans thus lost their last chance to conquer Verdun. Little changed for the soldiers at the front. They continued to experience the uninterrupted rhythm of attack and counterattack. Grenades, machine guns, flamethrowers, and poison gas determined their lives. Entire divisions were wiped out. New troops followed, only to suffer the same fate. But the certainty grew. The Germans had missed their target. Verdun would not fall.
The summer of 1916 finally made Verdun a symbol. In France, every soldier who fought there was considered a hero. Entire divisions proudly bore the designation Verdun Fighters. For the Germans, on the other hand, Verdun increasingly became a memorial to futility. Despite enormous sacrifices, they had achieved nothing that justified the original plan. Falkenhayn's idea of bleeding France to death there had turned into the opposite. Both sides bled to death equally. The summer of Verdun thus became a time of endless struggle, in which the battlefield itself became the enemy. Every hill, every village, every forest became a goal, which was fought for and lost again with immeasurable losses. The men who fought there later described it as a life in a hell with no beginning or end, where the line between attack and defense was blurred. At the end of the summer, Verdun was still in French hands. The Germans had made territorial gains and captured important forts, but the city and its defensive lines were in place. The French army had proven that it could not be broken. Thus, Germany's hopes of a decisive victory on the Meuse had failed. In the summer of 1916, Verdun had become a symbol of French steadfastness and a memorial to the senselessness of a war that no longer knew any winners, but only losers. Chapter 12. The Fall and Recapture of Fort Vaux. After the loss of Fort Douaumont in February 1916, the eyes of both sides turned to another bulwark of the Verdun line, Fort Vaux. This structure, smaller and less modern than Douaumont, was located east of the city and formed another cornerstone of the French defenses. Although it did not have the same strength as its famous neighbor, it was central to morale and strategic position. Whoever controlled Vaux had access to the heights east of Verdun and thus a better starting point for further attacks. In May and June 1916, the Germans intensified their attacks on Voie. The fort had been under heavy fire for weeks. Artillery shells had torn open the outer walls, damaged the roofs, and turned the interior into a labyrinth of rubble, smoke, and dust. The French garrison, led by Major Sylvain Raynal, had little hope of relief. Pétain and Nivelle were aware of the precarious situation, but in view of the overall situation, they could not risk a major offensive to save Voie. Instead, the small garrison had to endure, a mission that pushed them to the limits of what was possible. The defense of Fort Vaux became one of the most legendary episodes of the entire Battle of Verdun. The French soldiers were poorly equipped, had insufficient supplies, and were faced with superior numbers. The lack of water was particularly dramatic. The cisterns of the fort had been destroyed by shelling or had become inaccessible. After only a few days, the men suffered from terrible thirst. Reports say that they wrung out damp rags, collected drops from the walls, or tried to lick the dew from steel girders. Some began to use their own urine bottles as their last source. At the same time, the Germans relied on new weapons to break the resistance. Flamethrowers used in the narrow corridors turned the underground corridors into burning traps. Poison gas grenades filled the rooms with deadly smoke, and hand grenades exploded in the narrow passages. The French soldiers fought in an inferno in which there was no way to retreat. Nevertheless, they stood firm. Major Raynal, himself wounded, organized the defense until the last moment. On June 7, 1916, after days of uninterrupted fighting, Raynal finally had to capitulate.
The garrison was completely exhausted, without water, without ammunition, without hope. The Germans had penetrated deep into the fort, and any further endurance would have meant only senseless death. Raynal surrendered the fort on honorary terms. The Germans, impressed by the tenacity of the defenders, showed him respect. Raynal was allowed to keep his sword, a rare concession in this war.
For Franz, the loss of Fort Voie was another shock. Douaumont had already fallen into German hands und now auch das zweite importante Bollwerk. Newspapers spoke of a catastrophe, aber an derselben Zeit die Resistenz der Okkupation bekam ein Myth. Major Raynal wurde zelebriert als ein Held durchaus Franz. Obwohl er hat Bentegen Prisoner, er war konzidiert ein Symbol von Perseveranz. His men were honored, und Fort Voie was not seen in French tales als eine Lost-Position, sondern als Proof von heroischer Resistenz.
For the Germans, the fall of Vaux was another tactical success, but as with Douaumont, the price was high and the benefits limited. The fort was immediately in the target area of the French artillery. Grenades fell incessantly, destroying the grounds and making the stay a torture for the crew. Many German soldiers died in the narrow corridors, not from attacks, but from suffocation, fire, or collapses. Thus, the possession of the fort became more of a burden than an advantage. The summer of 1916 brought a turning point. While the Germans still hoped to conquer Verdun step by step, the Allied offensive on the Somme opened a new front on 1 July. The Supreme Army Command had to withdraw troops from Verdun to counter British and French attacks in the north. As a result, the offensive on the Meuse lost its momentum. What had started as a major blow in February threatened to turn into a senseless bloodshed with no result.
The French took advantage of the opportunity. Under Nivelle's command, they began to systematically recapture the lost positions in the autumn of 1916. With fresh troops, massive artillery, and clear planning, they directed their attacks at the two large forts, Douaumont and Voie. The reconquest of Voie became a goal that had not only military but also symbolic significance. They wanted to prove that France could not only defend but also fight back. In November 1916, the French offensive began. For weeks, they shelled the fort with heavy artillery. Entire ammunition depots were unloaded to smash the walls, roofs, and entrances. When the infantry finally advanced, they found hardly any organized resistance. The German defenders were completely worn down by hunger, thirst, and shelling. On November 2nd, they abandoned the fort, and the French entered triumphantly. The recapture of Fort Vaux was a turning point. Together with the almost simultaneous recapture of Fort Douaumont in October, it showed that the Germans had finally failed at Verdun. What had been celebrated as a triumph months earlier turned into a defeat. France had proven that it could not only endure but also fight back. For the soldiers who recaptured Vaux, it was a victory that was bought with immeasurable sacrifices. The fort was a ruin, littered with corpses, strewn with smoke and decay. Many of the men who entered it later said that they had seen hell for themselves. But for the French nation, this moment was a symbol. Verdun was alive, Verdun resisted, Verdun fought back. The fall and recapture of Fort Vaux exemplified the absurdity of the Battle of Verdun. Both sides had sacrificed tens of thousands of people for this structure, and in the end, it was little more than a ruined ruin. But the symbolic value outweighed the military value. For Germany, the possession of Vaux was a Pyrrhic victory. For France, its reconquest was a triumph of the will. Fort Vaux, along with Douaumont, became one of the central theaters of the battle. It stood for the suffering, the willingness to sacrifice, and the endless alternation of attack and defense that made Verdun the longest and bloodiest battle of the First World War. Chapter 13. The Holy Road, the French Supply Artery. No story about Verdun would be complete without the Voie Sacrée, the Holy Road. It was the lifeline of the French defense, a simple country road that stretched from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun and connected the hinterland with the front for about 60 kilometers. Without them, the fortress's defenses would have collapsed in the first few weeks. With it, however, it was possible to maintain an uninterrupted connection through which soldiers, weapons, ammunition, food, and hope reached the front. The importance of this road was recognized early on, but it was only under General Philippe Pétain that it became a symbol of perseverance. Pétain understood that Verdun could only be held if supplies and reinforcements flowed continuously. In view of the German plan to bleed out France at Verdun, it was crucial that the bloodstream of the French army never dried up. The Voie Sacrée thus became not only a logistical masterpiece, but also a mythical place that moved the entire nation. The organization of this gigantic transport project was unprecedented. From March 1916, convoys of trucks rolled across the road day and night. On average, a vehicle passed every 14 seconds in both directions. Trucks with ammunition, weapons, food, and troops drove in the direction of Verdun, and the wounded, exhausted, and empty vehicles came back. It is estimated that a total of around 90,000 men and 50,000 tons of material were transported by road per week. Maintenance was as daunting an undertaking as the transport itself. Hundreds of workers, mostly reservists or civilians, maintained the road around the clock. Horse-drawn carriages accompanying the trucks transported gravel, which was immediately dumped into potholes. Entire companies were busy smoothing the surface and repairing damage. Pétain knew that a standstill on the road would mean the end for Verdun. Therefore, the rule was introduced. No vehicle was allowed to stop the column. If a truck broke down, it was immediately pushed off the road, by force if necessary, and other vehicles picked up its load. The Voie Sacrée was thus a street without a break. It symbolized the unwavering determination to hold Verdun. The drivers, mostly young men without much training, lived in permanent danger. German planes attacked the columns, artillery shelled the road, and accidents were the order of the day. At night, the trucks drove without lights, guided only by the taillights of the front vehicles and the commandos of the military police. Those who fell asleep risked not only their own lives, but also the entire supply. Many drivers later reported that they kept nodding off while driving and were only kept awake by loud shouting or beatings. Despite the harshness, the Voie Sacrée developed into a symbol of the nation. Newspapers and posters celebrated the street as a sign of unity. It connected not only Bar-le-Duc with Verdun, but the entire French population with the soldiers at the front. Everyone knew that the future of France was decided on this road. Even in the smallest village, people spoke of the Holy Road, and many French people felt connected to the men who worked there day and night. The effect on morale was immense. For the soldiers at the front, the arrival of the columns was a sign that they were not abandoned. They saw how tirelessly new troops and material were brought in, and this gave them the strength to hold out. At the same time, the rotation that Pétain had introduced offered the soldiers the certainty that they would be relieved after a period in Verdun. Every French soldier should experience Verdun, but no one should stay there indefinitely. This system was only possible thanks to the uninterrupted supply via the Voie Sacrée. Die deutsche Seite war aware von der Bedeutung der Rot und dreite zu destroyen it oder alternativ zu unterbrechen it. But despite artillery fire und air raids, es war nie possible zu signifikant disrupt Traffic zu verhindern. Die französische Determination, die Rot offen zu halten, war zu groß. Die Organisation, das Pétain und seine Staatsräte erstattet hatte, war zu gut. Even if a section was destroyed, men were immediately ready to repair it. Over time, the Voie Sacrée grew beyond its purely military importance. It became a national myth, comparable to Verdun itself. The French saw in her a symbol of the willingness to make sacrifices, the organization, and the strength of their nation. The road was not just a path of asphalt and gravel, but a metaphor for the uninterrupted will to resist. After the battle, the Voie Sacrée was officially honored. Memorial plaques, monuments, and ceremonies commemorated their role. For many veterans, the memory of the endless columns, the dust, the noise, and the constant danger was a formative part of their experience. To this day, the road is a place of remembrance where you can understand the dimension of this logistical achievement. The Holy Road also showed how much the First World War was a war of organization and logistics. Battles were not only decided in the trenches, but on the roads, railways, and in the factories that made supplies possible. Verdun would not have been held without the Voie Sacrée. With it, however, the city became a symbol of resistance, and France proved that it was capable of resisting the German attack not only militarily, but also organizationally. For the men who fought or drove there, the road was a hell. Dust, noise, exhaustion, and constant danger determined their lives. But they knew that their task was crucial. In a war in which the individual soldier often felt that he was just a nameless cog in the machine, the Voie Sacrée offered the certainty that every mission counted. Every truck that reached Verdun was a small victory. Every wounded brought back a sign that sacrifices were not in vain. In this way, the Heilige Straße became more than just a supply artery. It became a symbol of life in the midst of death, a connection between home and front, between hope and horror. It was the bond that held France together while Verdun threatened to perish in the juggernaut of war. Chapter 14. Man as Material. Numbers of Victims and Perseverance Slogans. The Battle of Verdun had been intended from the beginning as a battle of attrition, but in the months of its course, it took on proportions that exceeded even the wildest imagination. The term material battle, which was coined at the time, said it all. People, weapons, ammunition, vehicles, and entire landscapes became consumer goods that were worn out to an unprecedented extent. What appeared to be a sober calculation in the plans of the general staffs turned into a cruel reality for the soldiers at the front. Already in the first few weeks, it became clear that the price for every meter of ground gained or lost was unimaginably high. Thousands of men died in a single attack. Entire regiments were wiped out without the front line shifting significantly. The losses increased from month to month, and soon Verdun had become a mill in which both armies were crushed. It is estimated that almost 800,000 soldiers were wounded, killed, or missing in the course of the 10-month battle, a figure that clearly shows the extent of the horror. For the French soldiers, Verdun meant that they were fighting in a hell that no one could gloss over. Every attack, every counterattack, every barrage claimed victims. Entire villages disappeared, not only from the map, but also from the population list. Fleury, one of the most famous examples, was conquered and lost 16 times until it was completely destroyed. The men who fought there became symbols of a nation determined not to give in, even if the price was unimaginably high. The Germans faced the same reality. They had hoped to bleed France dry at Verdun, but instead they lost hundreds of thousands themselves. Falkenhayn's plan to force the enemy to collapse through calculated sacrifices did not work as planned. Instead, the battle turned into a gigantic mutual battle that pushed both armies to the limit of their capabilities. The language of the general staffs reflected this view. There was talk of human material, as if the soldiers were raw materials such as coal or iron. In situation reports, it was soberly stated that a division was used up and had to be replaced by a fresh one. Behind these words were tens of thousands of dead, wounded, and traumatized. The individual soldier became a number in a statistic, his life part of a calculation, his death a prerequisite for the next attack. For the soldiers themselves, this feeling of interchangeability was difficult to bear. They knew that they were not seen as individuals, but as part of a vast apparatus. Still, they found solace in companionship and the idea that their sacrifice served a higher purpose. Verdun must not fall. This sentence became a slogan that outshone everything else.
For the French, Verdun was the heart of the nation, and everyone who fought there did so in the knowledge that they were part of a decisive test. Propaganda reinforced this image. Posters, newspaper articles, and speeches emphasized that the defenders of Verdun were heroes, that their sacrifice was necessary to save France. In schools, factories, and churches, Verdun became the central theme. On ne passe pas, they can't get through, became the motto not only at the front but throughout the country. This gave the soldiers at least an ideal justification for the immeasurable suffering they had to endure. The number of casualties was not only a military problem but also a social one. Entire cohorts of young men were decimated in Verdun. Families lost several sons. Villages lost their entire male youth. Especially in France, which had to mourn far more victims in relation to its population than Germany, Verdun left deep wounds. In some regions, people spoke of lost villages because hardly any young men returned. Nevertheless, the willingness to continue fighting was surprisingly high. This was not only due to propaganda, but also to a deep-rooted sense of duty. Many soldiers wrote in their letters home that they did not shy away from their sacrifice because they knew that they were defending France. Others admitted that they had long since lost faith in victory, but still fought because they did not want to abandon their comrades. The human material that the generals were talking about was in reality a mass of individuals who were confronted with fear, pain, and death every day. Their perseverance slogans were not only orders from above, but also an attempt to make the unbearable bearable. Those who said, "We'll hold out," often didn't mean the nation, but their small group of comrades in the trenches. The reality of the material war was also reflected in the technology. Machine guns, artillery, flamethrowers, and poison gas turned the battle into industrialized killing. In it, man was often only a small part of a huge machine. Attacks were planned like factory processes. So many grenades, so many men, so many minutes. The result was measured in terrain gain, which was often only a few hundred meters, bought with thousands of lives. Over time, the awareness began to prevail that Verdun could not be a place of classical victory. Neither Germany nor France would achieve a decisive breakthrough here. Instead, Verdun became the touchstone of perseverance. Those who held out longer, those who could make more sacrifices, those who better mobilized their population and army would ultimately win the symbolic victory. In this way, man actually became material, not only in language, but in the reality of war. But at the same time, Verdun proved that people are more than numbers. They fought not only because they were asked to, but also because they gave themselves a purpose. This sense could be patriotism, comradeship, or the desire not to let one's own suffering seem in vain. In the end, Verdun was a battle without a winner. The number of victims was so high that it was almost impossible to comprehend them. But for France, Verdun became a symbol of survival. For Germany, a symbol of futile hope. In both countries, the perseverance slogans shaped the thinking of an entire generation. "They won't get through" was more than a sentence. It was a self-commitment that turned people into material, but at the same time gave them the strength to live on as long as it was somehow possible. When the autumn of 1916 began, the Battle of Verdun had already been raging for more than half a year. Millions of shells had been fired, hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded, entire landscapes had been devastated. But despite all the casualties, the front line had hardly shifted. The German hope of forcing France to collapse on the Meuse had not been fulfilled. Nor did the French succeed in driving the Germans out of all their conquered positions. What remained was a grueling struggle in which both sides felt one thing above all: fatigue. The men at the front had been living in the inferno for months. The summer had reached the height of brutality with the battles for Fleury, Thiamont, and Souville, but the autumn did not bring any relief either. The weather deteriorated, rain and cold took an additional toll on the soldiers. Trenches turned into morass, dugouts were full of water, and diseases spread. Those who had survived the summer now had to struggle with the new threat of hypothermia, pneumonia, and epidemics. The soldiers were exhausted, not only physically but also mentally. Many had lost comrades, entire regiments had been smashed. The constant thunder of the guns, the sight of the dead and maimed, life in mud and dirt had left its mark. Letters from this time show an increasing resignation. Men wrote that they no longer saw any sense, that they only functioned like machines, that they had long since lost all hope of an imminent end. The general staffs also realized that Verdun could no longer be ended by a decisive battle. On the German side, they had to admit that the original strategy had failed. Falkenhayn's plan to bleed out France had turned into the opposite. Both armies bled equally dry. In addition, the Battle of the Somme, which had been raging since July, had further burdened German resources. Many units had to be withdrawn from Verdun in order to be deployed on the Somme. This meant that the offensive on the Meuse finally lost its momentum. In France, Pétain and his successor Nivelle had understood that it was now a matter of maintaining morale. The slogan "On ne passe pas" remained the leitmotif. But here, too, it was known that the population and the army were reaching their limits. The constant influx of new divisions across the Voie Sacrée secured the defense. But the rotation also meant that by now almost every French soldier had seen Verdun. Almost every family in France now had someone who had fought or died there. Verdun was no longer just a battle, but a national trauma that gripped the entire country. The autumn also brought new problems. The supply situation deteriorated, not only at the front but also at home. France had to make enormous efforts to compensate for the losses of men, material, and food. Women worked in factories. Children collected metal. Agriculture suffered from a shortage of workers. The situation was similar in Germany. The so-called Swede winter of 1916-17 was already on the horizon, and the population began to feel the stresses of the war more and more. Verdun was just one battlefield of many, but it was the most visible symbol of the endless sacrifice demanded of the people. Militarily, both sides tried to gain small advantages in the autumn. The French began a series of counterattacks aimed at regaining lost positions. Especially in October, they succeeded in recapturing Fort Douaumont, which had been in German hands since February. This success was of great symbolic importance. Although the fort was now only a ruin, its return to national hands was priceless for French morale. Shortly afterwards, Fort Vaux also fell back to the French. In doing so, they had not only regained important positions, but also sent a clear signal. Verdun had not fallen, and it would not fall. The Germans, on the other hand, were on the defensive in the autumn. Their attacks had not yielded any decisive success, and the losses were so high that they were forced to practically stop the offensive. Although they tried to hold on to their conquered positions, this also cost countless victims. For many German soldiers, Verdun became a nightmare with no prospect of success. The former dream of a breakthrough had given way to a sober reality. They were caught in a war of attrition from which there was no escape.
Fatigue was evident not only at the front, but also in the home countries. In France, pressure grew on the government to finally find a way out of the catastrophe. But at the same time, it was clear that giving in at Verdun was politically and morally impossible. Too much had already been sacrificed. Too many dead lay in the earth around the fortress. Withdrawing would have meant that all these sacrifices would have been pointless. The situation was similar in Germany. Falkenhayn was dismissed in August 1916, and Hindenburg and Ludendorff took over the Supreme Army Command. But even they were no longer able to fundamentally change the situation on the Meuse. The autumn of 1916 was therefore a time of realization. Verdun could not be won. Instead, it had become a symbol of mutual bleeding. Both sides held on because they couldn't let go, because they didn't want to admit that all the sacrifices had been in vain. The war on the Meuse was no longer a means of bringing about a decision, but a compulsion from which no one escaped. This changed little for the soldiers in the trench. They continued to live in the inferno of mud, death, and fear. They saw how comrades died, how villages disappeared, how nature itself perished. But they continued to fight because they knew that their leadership saw no way out. Every day became a struggle for survival, every night a struggle with despair. The autumn did not bring a decision, but it brought a new dimension of suffering. The men were exhausted, their bodies weakened, their souls scarred. Verdun had gone from a battle to a state, a synonym for the endless killing and dying of the First World War. As 1916 drew to a close, it was clear that Verdun would have no winner. What remained was the wear and tear, the fatigue, the feeling that the war had taken on a life of its own, and that people were only objects in a cruel process. In the autumn of 1916, Verdun had finally become a symbol of senseless suffering, a symbol that had an impact far beyond the front and captivated entire societies. Chapter 16. The Reconquest of Douaumont and Voie. As the autumn of 1916 settled over the devastated land around Verdun, the dynamics of the battle began to shift. What had begun in February as a major German offensive had meanwhile become a war of attrition with no clear outcome. But while the Germans were increasingly forced onto the defensive, the French managed to regain lost key positions with targeted counteroffensives. The culmination of this development was the recapture of Fort Douaumont and Fort Voie, two structures that had become symbols of German successes in the months before, but also of French losses. Fort Douaumont, the largest and most modern fort in the fortress belt, had fallen into German hands in February 1916 almost without a fight. His loss had shaken the French nation and deeply affected the morale of the defenders. Since then, it had become the centerpiece of the German position around Verdun. But the reality for the crew was anything but a triumphal procession. The fort was under constant French artillery fire, its corridors filled with smoke, stench, and corpses. Explosions and fires repeatedly claimed hundreds of lives who were trapped in the narrow corridors. The former pride of the German offensive had become a deadly trap. In October 1916, the French decided to recapture the fort. Weeks of preparations preceded the offensive. In the meantime, Pétain had risen to become commander-in-chief of the entire French army, and his successor, Nivelle, relied on massive artillery deployments to break the German resistance. For days, shells rained down on Douaumont, so many that the walls of the fort, which had been considered almost indestructible, crumbled into rubble and ashes. Entire cover plates were torn open, corridors buried, tank turrets destroyed. For the crew inside, it was hell. Many suffocated in the smoke, others were buried alive. When the French infantry advanced on 24 October, they found a fort that hardly allowed for defense. The Germans, worn down and decimated, had hardly any strength left to defend themselves. French troops invaded, and after months of losses, hoisted the tricolor over Douaumont again. The jubilation in France was boundless. Newspapers and posters celebrated the return of the fort. Politicians spoke of a victory that had justified the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands. In reality, Douaumont was only a ruin, but its symbolic value was priceless. A few days later, the recapture of Fort Voie followed. This fort had fallen into German hands in June after heroic defense under Major Raynal. The story of the thirst-stricken garrison, which had fought to its last breath, had already become a myth in France. His loss had hurt, but it had also been a testament to his unwavering tenacity. Now, in November, it was up to the French to take back the fort. As with Douaumont, the attack began with a huge artillery barrage. The fort, already badly damaged by the fighting in the summer, could not withstand the barrage. German troops stationed there experienced the same torment as the French before them: crampedness, darkness, grenades, smoke, and a constant threat. When the French infantry attacked on 2 November, resistance was low. The Germans withdrew, and the French retook Vox without much fighting. With the recapture of the two forts, the French had turned the tide. Verdun, which seemed to be on the verge of falling in the spring, was now unshakably in French hands. For the Germans, the loss of the forts meant not only a military weakening, but also a moral defeat. All the successes they had achieved in the months before were gone. The sacrifices they had made seemed in vain. For France, on the other hand, the success was a moral triumph. Although no one was able to bring back the hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, the return from Douaumont and Voie was tangible proof that the suffering had not been in vain. The propaganda used the moment extensively. Pictures of the French flag waving over the forts again were circulated throughout the country. There was talk of a victory of the will, of the fact that France had not only stood firm but had fought back. However, the reconquest was not only symbolically important, it also had practical consequences. With Douaumont and Voie back in French hands, the German position was significantly weakened before Verdun. Their offensive had finally failed, and the initiative now lay with the French. Although the battle officially lasted until December, the decisive course had been set in October and November. Verdun was saved, and Germany had missed its target. For the soldiers who took part in the reconquest, it was an ambivalent victory. They knew that they were fighting for ruins, for rubble that had little military value. But they also knew that these ruins were symbols of their nation's pride, resistance, and sacrifice. Many later wrote that although they hardly believed in the war anymore, they still had the feeling that they had fought for something bigger in Verdun. There was frustration on the German side. Officers reported that their men hardly had the strength to carry out further attacks. The losses were enormous, the morale shaken. Many soldiers spoke of Verdun as a tomb from which no one returned unscathed. The dream of breaking France there was finally over. Thus, the recapture of Douaumont and Vox marked a turning point not only in the battle but in the war as a whole. It showed that even in a battle of materials in which people and machines alike were worn out, will and determination could make the difference. France had proven that it would not collapse. Germany had proven that it could lead huge offensives but not achieve a final victory. The two forts, once symbols of German strength, were now symbols of French resistance. Their recapture gave the country the strength to continue fighting, even in the years to come when the war was to claim many more victims. For the world public, Verdun thus finally became the symbol of the First World War, a battle that produced no winner but welded one nation together and wore down another. In the end, Douaumont and Voie were nothing more than destroyed buildings in a devastated landscape, but they stood for what shaped the war: victims, suffering, perseverance, and the immeasurable senselessness of a conflict in which even victories left only ruins. When the winter of 1916 began, a deceptive silence lay over Verdun. Behind this silence was not peace, but exhaustion. The battle had been raging since February, and what had begun as a German blow to decide the game had become a murderous battle of attrition in which both sides had lost hundreds of thousands. Now, in the last part of the year, it became clear that the great offensive on the Meuse was finally coming to an end. The landscape around Verdun was hardly recognizable as such. Sleet and frost had settled over a terrain that was plowed by shells, riddled with barbed wire, and strewn with debris. Entire forests had disappeared. Villages existed only as piles of stones. Rivers had changed their beds due to the constant shelling. Soldiers who held out in the trenches spoke of the fact that they were no longer fighting in France or Germany, but on an alien planet, a lunar landscape without life. For the men at the front, winter meant a new torment. The cold penetrated through the soaked uniforms, shelters offered little protection, and the constant wind made every break an ordeal. Fuel was scarce, hot meals were rare, and many soldiers suffered frostbite.
Diseases such as bronchitis and pneumonia spread. Those who had survived the summer could now die of hunger or cold in winter. The French army had won important symbolic victories in the autumn with the recapture of Fort Douaumont and Fort Voie. These successes boosted morale and made defenders feel that their sacrifices were not in vain. Now, however, General Nivelle's main focus was on consolidating the lines. The French wanted to keep the initiative, but they were aware that their forces were limited. So they relied on targeted attacks that were intended to further weaken the Germans without exhausting their own reserves. But even if the big attacks were over, that didn't mean that calm returned. Day after day, smaller battles raged. Patrols combed through no man's land. Artillery fire thundered incessantly. Again and again, there were attacks on individual positions or bunkers, which ended in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. The front was alive, even if the great momentum of the offensive was missing. For the soldiers, this made no difference. They continued to live in constant danger. Every day brought new dead and wounded. In December 1916, the French launched another major offensive. They wanted to keep up the pressure and set the Germans back once and for all. With massive artillery support, they attacked the ridges east of Verdun. New techniques were used: better coordinated fire rollers, stronger cooperation between infantry and artillery, and the consistent use of the rotation systems that had been tried and tested in the meantime. The Germans, weakened and demoralized, could not withstand the attacks. Several villages and positions were lost, and the front shifted in favor of the French. This success marked the final end of the German offensive. What began in February as an attempt to hit France decisively ended in December with a clear French advantage. Verdun had not only been held, but also recaptured in parts. For the French, this was a reason to triumph, even if the losses had been immense. For the Germans, it was an admission that their plan had failed. The balance of the winter was devastating. Both sides had lost, killed, wounded, or missing a total of almost 800,000 men. Entire divisions were wiped out, age groups decimated, families destroyed. The landscape was devastated, morale severely shaken. Verdun had become the epitome of the futility of war, a place where it became clear that industrial warfare was no longer aimed at victory, but at attrition. For the French nation, however, the battle had a significance that went beyond the purely military. Verdun became a symbol of resistance, a myth that embodied the unity of the country. On ne passe pas was not just a slogan, but an experience shared by millions. Almost every division had been deployed in Verdun at some point. Almost every family had a relative who had fought there. Verdun thus became the common denominator, the place where the nation proved its steadfastness. For Germany, on the other hand, Verdun was a trauma. The attempt to break France there had not only failed, but had exhausted its own strength. In the years to come, the Reich would never be able to fully compensate for this loss. Verdun was left as a symbol of futility, as an example of how strategic plans could dissolve into blood and mud in reality. In the winter of 1916, the Great Offensive ended, but the war continued. Verdun was not the end, but only a chapter in a conflict that was to last almost 2 years. But for the men who had fought there, it was clear: they had seen hell. No other battle of the First World War was so strongly associated with horror and senselessness in the memories of the soldiers as Verdun. When the year 1916 came to an end, Verdun was not a victory, but a state of exhaustion. The Great Offensive had failed, the losses were inconceivable, the landscape destroyed. But for France, it was a triumph of will, for Germany, a memorial of failure. The winter did not bring peace, but only the realization that the war was far from over, and that Verdun would remain a symbol that shaped generations. Chapter 18: Verdun in the French Culture of Remembrance. Hardly any other battle of the First World War has gained such central importance in France as that of Verdun.
What began in 1916 as a desperate defensive struggle was transformed into a national symbol during the war, which went far beyond military reality. Verdun stood not only for a military achievement, but for the collective experience of a nation that refused to give in, no matter what the price. In the years and decades that followed, the memory of Verdun became an integral part of French identity. Even during the battle, Verdun was stylized as a myth. General Pétain, the organizer of the defense, coined phrases such as "On les aura," we will get them, and above all the slogan "On ne passe pas," they won't get through. These words were immediately picked up by the press, spread on posters, and repeated in speeches. Soldiers who marched to Verdun knew that they were not just defending a position, but a symbol of the entire nation. For the civilian population, Verdun became a touchstone. Everyone had to do their part, whether in the factory, in the field, or in the family that sent their sons to the front.
After the end of the battle in 1916, glorification began immediately. Although the losses on both sides were incredibly high and the military gains were small, Verdun was celebrated as a French victory. The reason was not so much the gain of ground, but the perseverance itself. France had not capitulated, Verdun had not fallen, and that alone was enough to interpret the battle as a triumph. Soon it was called La Bataille de la Nation, the Battle of the Nation, in which all of France had gathered to resist.
The culture of remembrance took concrete shape. Shortly after the war, veterans associations began to erect monuments. Large graves were built in cemeteries around Verdun to honor the victims. In particular, the Douaumont ossuary, inaugurated in 1932, became a central place of remembrance. This massive structure contains the remains of more than 130,000 unknown soldiers from both sides, whose bodies have never been identified. For visitors, the ossuary was a shock. Behind the glass windows, you could see the mountains of bones, skulls, and bones, which vividly demonstrated the senselessness of the slaughter. The destroyed villages around Verdun also remained part of the memory. Places such as Fleury, Bézonvaux, or Ornes were completely wiped out in the war and were not rebuilt after 1918. Instead, they were declared Dorfe morts pour la France, villages that died for France. They were symbolically given a mayor, although no one lived there anymore, and still serve as memorials to the sacrifice of the civilian population. In the interwar period, Verdun became a place of pilgrimage. Every year, tens of thousands of Frenchmen, veterans, students, and families came to visit the battlefields. Political leaders gave speeches highlighting the importance of Verdun for national unity. President Raymond Poincaré called the city a heart that beat for France. For many French people, Verdun was not just a place, but a feeling, proof that the nation stood together at the worst moment. However, the memory of Verdun was not only triumphant, but also ambivalent. Many veterans suffered severe trauma, physical injuries, and the memory of unimaginable suffering. In her memoirs and stories, pain often shines through less pride than pain. Nevertheless, this suffering also fit into the national narrative. It was interpreted as a necessary sacrifice that had ensured France's survival. In the political culture of the 1920s and 1930s, Verdun played a double role. On the one hand, it was a symbol of patriotism and defensiveness. On the other hand, it was increasingly understood as a reminder for peace. International meetings, in particular between France and Germany, were held in Verdun to commemorate the disaster and prevent it from happening again. In 1936, French and German veterans laid wreaths together, an early sign of reconciliation, but one that was soon to be overshadowed by the coming World War. After the Second World War, the memory of Verdun took on a new dimension. Now it was no longer just about France's victory, but also about overcoming the enmity between Germany and France. The gesture of 1984 became particularly famous when François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, the presidents of France and Germany, stood hand in hand in front of the Douaumont ossuary. This picture went around the world and became a symbol of German-French friendship.
Verdun, once the place of bitter enmity, became a place of reconciliation.
Today, Verdun is a central part of the French culture of remembrance of the First World War. School classes regularly visit the battlefields, monuments, and museums. Commemorations are held every year to highlight the importance of Verdun as a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. At the same time, the battle is increasingly viewed critically. Historians and educators point to the senselessness of the slaughter, to the inconceivable sacrifices that were made for a few kilometers of ground. The French culture of remembrance has thus shaped Verdun in two directions. On the one hand, as a proud symbol that embodies the perseverance of a nation. On the other hand, as a reminder that war brings nothing but destruction. Both dimensions are firmly linked and make Verdun a unique place of remembrance. Today, the city itself is shaped by its history. Museums, cemeteries, monuments, and restored trenches make the past tangible. Visitors report that they feel a heaviness in Verdun that is not found elsewhere. It is as if the suffering of the hundreds of thousands of dead is still present in the landscape. Thus, Verdun remains a paradoxical symbol in the French culture of remembrance to this day. It stands for pride and pain, for victory and loss, for patriotism and pacifism. In no other place do the experiences of the First World War condense as much as here. Verdun is more than a battle. It is a national memory, a collective trauma, and a memorial that connects generations. Chapter 19. The German View of Verdun, Victory or Failure. Für den deutschen Seit, Verdun war ein Gamble vom Beginnen. Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn hat die Offensive als ein kalkuliertes Means von Attrition entworfen. Assumed, dass Franz würde tun alles, in his power zu defenden Verdun und dass der Enemy könnte bled dry there. Der Goal war nicht ein Quick-Durchbruch, sondern die systematische Destruktion von French-Human-Reserven. In soberen Memoranden Falkenhayn sprach von der Fakt, dass Franz hatte zu Faust to the last man zu deploy its forces at a focal point. But what appeared to be a clever strategy on paper turned out to be eine Katastrophe in Realität, was auch Deutschland hat. At first, there was jubilation among the German public. The rapid fall of Fort Douaumont in February 1916 was celebrated as a sensational victory. Newspapers reported that the impregnable fortress had fallen, and some commentators announced that the road to Paris was now open. But it soon became clear that Verdun was not a place of breakthrough, but a place of stagnation. The French did not give way, but held out with desperate tenacity. Every German success was bought with immense losses, and the mood began to change. In the officer corps, the assessment was also divided. Some saw Verdun as a military necessity, others criticized the lack of clarity of purpose early on. Falkenhayn himself was dismissed in August 1916, officially not only because of Verdun, but the battle played a decisive role. His strategy had missed its target. France was not broken. On the contrary, the resistance had welded the nation together. At the same time, the German losses were so high that the hoped-for advantage turned into the opposite. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who replaced Falkenhayn, took a sober view of the situation. They realized that Verdun could no longer be won and shifted the focus of operations to other fronts. Verdun became a symbol of waste, a place where German forces had been tied up and exhausted without a decisive victory being won. But although the military assessment was clearly negative, Verdun remained more ambivalent in the German public. Propaganda played a role in this. During the war, attempts were made to portray the battles for Verdun as proof of German steadfastness. The heroic death of the soldiers was glorified, the bravery emphasized. Official accounts spoke of defensive struggles and heroism, not of a failed offensive. For many families who had lost sons, fathers, or brothers, this was a consolation, albeit a weak one. After the war, the view changed. The defeat of 1918 put Verdun in a different light. Now the battle appeared as an example of the futility of German warfare, as a symbol of a misguided strategy that had wasted human lives. In the memoirs of many officers and politicians, Verdun was viewed critically. Some blamed Falkenhayn, others saw the problem in the lack of support from the Supreme Army Command. In any case, it was clear that Verdun had not brought Germany closer to victory, but had devoured resources that would have been urgently needed on other fronts. Nevertheless, Verdun remained present in the German culture of remembrance after 1918. Veterans associations held memorial services, monuments were erected, and plaques for the fallen were found in many cities. But unlike France, where Verdun was celebrated as a symbol of national resistance, in Germany it was more of a place of mourning and bitterness. There was no myth of Verdun in the positive sense, but rather an awareness of the tragedy. This view was reflected in literature and art. Writers such as Ernst Jünger and later Erich Maria Remarque described the front as hell, as a place where the individual counted for nothing and violence was incessant. Verdun appeared in many stories as a cipher for the horror of trench warfare. It was less about victory or defeat than about the experience of being completely at the mercy of an industrial machinery of death. Politically, Verdun was rarely directly discussed in Germany after the war. The Weimar Republic was under the impression of defeat and the Treaty of Versailles, and memory focused on the war as a whole rather than individual battles. Nevertheless, Verdun remained present as a name in the collective memory. Families remembered the fallen, veterans told of their experiences, and the battle was cited as a cautionary tale in schools and memorial events. While in France, Verdun became the epitome of national unity, in Germany it was a symbol of a futile strategy. It raised the question of whether the battle could be considered a victory or a defeat at all. Some historians argue that Germany at least did not lose Verdun, as it was able to hold large parts of the terrain for months, and France suffered equally heavy losses. But reality spoke a different language. The goal of wearing down France had not been achieved. And in the end, it was the French who recaptured Douaumont and Voie and retained the initiative. So Verdun remained a failure for Germany, even if it was not officially named as such. The soldiers had fulfilled their duty, they had stood firm and made enormous sacrifices. But their sacrifice did not bring victory, only exhaustion. The awareness that hundreds of thousands had died without a tangible result being achieved deeply marked German memory. Over time, the pacifist interpretation also gained weight in Germany. Especially after the Second World War, Verdun became a symbol of the senselessness of war in general. In textbooks, commemorative events, and political speeches, Verdun was no longer seen as part of a strategic discussion, but as a warning. While France preserved Verdun as a symbol of perseverance, Germany preserved it as a symbol of failure, and it was precisely for this reason that it became a common European place of remembrance. In the end, the German view of Verdun remained trapped between two poles: respect for the soldiers' courage to sacrifice, and the realization that these sacrifices were in vain. Victory or failure, this question no longer arose. For Germany, Verdun was a defeat of strategy, a defeat of the hope of a decisive blow, and a memorial to the fact that even a seemingly clever plan could sink into the reality of industrialized war. Chapter 20. Resonance. Verdun as a symbol of the First World War. When the fighting at Verdun subsided in December 1916, it was clear that this battle had not ended like others. There was no clear winner, no decisive territorial change, no strategic goal that would have justified the use of men and material. Instead, at the end of 1916, Verdun stood as a symbol of the First World War itself. Endless killing, immeasurable sacrifices, a landscape that had been reduced to rubble and ashes, and a memory that would mark entire generations. The aftermath was immense. For France, Verdun became the centerpiece of national memory,
a monument of resistance that embodied the unity of the nation. Every soldier who had fought there was considered a hero, and the phrase "on ne passe pas" became part of the French identity. France could say, "Verdun has not fallen." This dislike was declared a victory, and it helped to turn the tremendous losses into a bearable narrative.
For Germany, Verdun was the opposite. It stood for a plan that had not worked, for an offensive that had been suffocated in the blood of its own soldiers. Verdun became a symbol of failure and futility. Even though German troops had shown enormous bravery there, the result remained negative. The soldiers had sacrificed themselves, but the strategic goals had not been achieved. Verdun was therefore less glorified than lamented in German memory, and it shaped skepticism towards military leaders who plunged into senseless adventures. But beyond the national interpretations, Verdun soon became an international symbol. Even during the war, newspapers around the world reported on the battle. Journalists called it the Hell of Verdun, or the Bloodbath of the Meuse. After the war, it became a prime example of the cruelty of modern war in school textbooks and history works. Verdun had become not just a battle, but a slogan. When people spoke of the senselessness of the First World War, this name almost always came up. The landscape itself was preserved as a memorial. Unlike many other battlefields that were used for agriculture again after the war, it was decided to leave large parts of the area around Verdun untouched. The ground was too destroyed, too dangerous because of unexploded ordnance, mines, and toxins. Entire regions were declared a red zone that could no longer be settled or cultivated. There, the craters, the remains of barbed wire, and the ruins remained as visible scars in the earth. With the construction of the Douaumont ossuary, Verdun was given a central place of remembrance. The mountains of bones that were collected there made the extent of the losses visible. Visitors looking through the glass windows into the chambers did not see abstract numbers, but the real remains of hundreds of thousands of men whose identities had been erased. This anonymity of the dead reinforced the impression that it was not individuals who had died in Verdun, but an entire generation. In the interwar period, Verdun served both as a symbol of national pride in France and as a reminder of peace in Europe. State visits, veterans' meetings, and commemoration ceremonies took place there. But the political instrumentalization could not be overlooked. In France, Verdun became proof that it had been able to repel the hereditary enemy. In Germany, on the other hand, some political forces used the memory of Verdun to claim that the soldiers had been undefeated in the field, and that the defeat had only come about through betrayal at home. It was only after the Second World War that the importance of Verdun changed fundamentally. Now the idea of reconciliation came to the fore. The famous gesture of 1984, when François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl stood hand in front of the ossuary, made Verdun a symbol of German-French friendship. A place of hatred had become a place of peace. This change was not a matter of course. It was the result of decades of work by politicians, historians, and veterans who wanted the dead not to have died in vain, but to learn a lesson from their sacrifice. Today, Verdun is considered the symbol par excellence of the First World War. When visitors from all over the world see the battlefields, they feel the dimension of horror. Museums, cemeteries, and monuments convey that this is not about heroism in the classical sense, but about the suffering of people who were trapped in a machine they could not control. Verdun thus stands for the 20th century like hardly any other place. For the transition from the wars of the generals to the wars of industry, in which entire societies were mobilized and burned. But Verdun is also a reflection of the culture of remembrance. In France, it remains a place of pride. In Germany, a place of mourning. And together, it is a place of admonition. In both countries, it is deeply rooted in the collective memory, and it is used again and again to remind new generations of the horrors of war. The symbolic power of Verdun is not only in the numbers, even if they are inconceivable. almost 300,000 dead and over 400,000 wounded. It lies above all in the fact that a whole world of hopes and illusions has been destroyed here. The dream of a quick war, of a decisive battle, of the heroic deed, all this was shattered in the trenches of Verdun. Instead, one realization remained, that in the age of machines, war could no longer be a victory, but only destruction. The reverberations of Verdun continue to the present day. When politicians give speeches about peace today, this name almost always comes up. When students learn about the First World War, they often visit Verdun. And when historians explain the 20th century, they often start here. Because Verdun concentrates, like a magnifying glass, the brutality, senselessness, and tragedy of modern war.
In the end, Verdun became more than a battle. It became a myth, a legend, a memorial. It became a symbol that stood for both the pride of a nation and the grief of an entire generation. And it became a common place of remembrance that turned enemies into partners. Verdun is thus the symbol of the First World War par excellence, a place where the horrors, the victims, and the lessons of war are condensed. A place that reminds us that war is no longer heroic, but only an endless murder. A place that shows that remembrance can be more than mourning. It can also be reconciliation.